The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the basement of the Asheville Historical Society, casting a sterile glow over rows of archival boxes that held generations of forgotten memories. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her magnifying lamp for the third time that morning, her eyes burning from hours of examining 19th-century photographs. At 34, she had dedicated the last decade of her life to photographic restoration, but lately, the work felt increasingly mechanical, each damaged image blending into the next in an endless stream of faded faces and deteriorating paper. Outside, October rain pelted against the narrow basement windows, the kind of persistent Appalachian drizzle that could last for days. Sarah could hear it mixing with the distant rumble of traffic on Biltmore Avenue, the modern world pressing in on this underground sanctuary of the past. She reached for her coffee mug, finding it cold and half-empty, a film forming on the surface. How long had she been sitting here? The digital clock on the wall read 2:47 p.m. She had arrived at 7 that morning. The photograph before her was part of a collection recently donated by the estate of Eleanor Blackwood, a woman who had died at 96 in a nursing home in Black Mountain. Her family, eager to clear out the old woman's belongings, had dumped 12 boxes of materials at the Historical Society with barely a word about their contents. Most of it was standard fare: family portraits, land deeds, correspondence. But this particular photograph had caught Sarah's attention the moment she pulled it from its protective sleeve. It showed a small wooden church, the kind that dotted the Appalachian Mountains in the late 1800s, with rough-hewn timber walls and a simple steeple. The structure sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to press in from all sides. In front of the church stood approximately 20 people, arranged in formal rows as was customary for group portraits of that era. The men wore dark suits despite the apparent summer heat, their beards trimmed and their expressions stern. The women were dressed in their Sunday best, high-collared dresses with long sleeves, their hair pulled back severely from their faces. What had initially drawn Sarah's eye was the exceptional clarity of the image. Unlike many photographs from that period, this one had been stored carefully, protected from light and moisture. The glass plate negative had survived remarkably intact, allowing for a level of detail that was rare in images of that vintage. She could make out individual boards in the church wall, the weave of fabric in the clothing, even the calluses on the hands of the men standing in the front row. But it was during the digital scanning process, when she increased the resolution to examine potential damage to the plate, that Sarah noticed something that made her stop cold. In the second row, slightly to the left of center, stood a child. A girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with light-colored hair that hung loose around her shoulders in a style that seemed oddly informal compared to the other children in the photograph. She wore a simple dress, lighter in color than those around her, and her expression was different too. While most of the subjects stared at the camera with the rigid formality expected of the era, this child's face showed something else. Sadness, perhaps. Or resignation. Sarah increased the magnification, zooming in on the girl's figure. The image pixelated slightly, but the detail remained sharp enough to see what had escaped notice during the initial examination. The child was barefoot. In itself, this wasn't unusual for rural Appalachian children in the 1870s, many of whom went without shoes during the warmer months. But it was the color that struck Sarah as wrong. The girl's feet, from the ankles down, were stained a dark, almost black color. It wasn't shadow or a defect in the photograph. The staining was too uniform, too deliberately applied to be accidental damage to the image. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing through possibilities. A developing error? No, the rest of the image was pristine. Natural discoloration of the paper? Impossible. The digital scan was taken directly from the glass plate negative, which showed the same dark staining. She had restored thousands of photographs in her career, and she had never seen anything quite like this. The staining was clearly visible on the original image, captured by the camera in 1874. She needed a second opinion. Sarah pulled out her phone and texted Dr. James Harding, a colleague who taught photographic history at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. They had worked together on several projects over the years, and if anyone could help her understand what she was seeing, it would be him. She attached a high-resolution crop of the child's section of the photograph and typed, Ever seen anything like this in a vintage photo? 1874 Appalachian church group. Notice the child's feet. While waiting for a response, Sarah turned her attention to the documentation that had accompanied the photograph. In Eleanor Blackwood's meticulous handwriting, a note had been attached to the protective sleeve. Hickory Grove Church, Madison County, summer 1874. Grandmother Rebecca's congregation. The child is Anne Marie Caldwell. Nothing more. No explanation for the unusual detail that now consumed Sarah's attention. Her phone buzzed. James had responded, "In my office. Can you bring it over? This is fascinating." 20 minutes later, Sarah was hurrying across the UNC Asheville campus, the photograph carefully secured in a weatherproof portfolio case. The rain had intensified, turning the walkways into small streams that overflowed their drainage paths. Students huddled under umbrellas or sprinted between buildings, their backpacks held over their heads as makeshift shields. Sarah barely noticed the weather, her mind focused entirely on the mystery that had suddenly transformed her routine workday into something unexpected. James Harding's office was located in Carpen Hall, a modern building that seemed out of place among the older structures on campus. At 62, James was nearing retirement, but his enthusiasm for historical photography remained undiminished. He had published 3 books on early American photography and was considered one of the leading experts on 19th-century Appalachian visual culture. He looked up as Sarah entered, water dripping from her jacket onto the worn carpet. "You're soaked," he observed, gesturing to a chair piled with books. "Move those anywhere. Let me see what you've got." Sarah carefully removed the photograph from its case and laid it on James's desk, then pulled up the high-resolution digital file on her laptop. James leaned forward, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and studied the image in silence for several minutes. Sarah watched his expression change from curiosity to confusion to something approaching excitement. "This is extraordinary," he finally said, his voice quiet. "The preservation quality is exceptional for this period. And you're right about the child's feet. That's not photographic damage or a processing artifact. That staining was present when the photograph was taken." He zoomed in on the digital file, examining the image from multiple angles. "Have you researched the location?" "Hickory Grove Church." "Not yet," Sarah admitted. "I only noticed the detail a few hours ago. The note says Madison County, summer of 1874. And the child's name is Anne Marie Caldwell." James was already typing on his computer, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. "Madison County, North Carolina. Hickory Grove Church." He paused, reading something on his screen. "There's a historical marker near Marshall, the county seat. The church burned down in 1923, but there are some records at the Madison County Historical Society. And look at this." He turned his monitor toward Sarah. "There's a newspaper article from the Asheville Citizen-Times, dated 1967. Local historian writing about forgotten churches of Madison County. Hickory Grove is mentioned. Says it was known for its connection to the..." He trailed off, his eyes widening slightly. Sarah leaned forward, trying to read the screen. "Connection to what?" "To the indigo trade," James finished. Apparently, several families in that area grew and processed indigo plants in the 1870s and 1880s. It was a small operation, nothing like the large-scale plantations in the coastal regions, but there's a reference here to home-based indigo processing in the Hickory Grove community. He looked up at Sarah, his expression thoughtful. "Indigo processing stains skin dark blue, almost black. It's notoriously difficult to wash off, especially when you're working with it regularly. The chemical compounds bond with the skin." Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of the photograph. The dark staining on Anne Marie Caldwell's feet suddenly made sense in a new context. So this child might have been working in indigo processing? "It's possible," James said carefully. "But we need more information. Indigo work was typically done by adults, though children certainly helped with various agricultural tasks in that era. The question is why her feet would be so heavily stained. Usually, it would be the hands that showed the most discoloration from handling the plants and processing the dye." He paused, thinking. unless she was involved in a specific part of the process that required barefoot work. Some traditional methods involved crushing or treading the plant material. Sarah studied the photograph again, seeing it now with fresh eyes. The child's sad expression, her informal appearance compared to the other subjects, the dark staining that marked her as different from everyone else in the frame. We need to find out more about Anne-Marie Caldwell. Who she was, what happened to her, why she's in this photograph looking so different from everyone else. James nodded slowly. This could be historically significant. Child labor in Appalachian communities is not well documented for this period, especially in small-scale agricultural operations. If we can establish that this child was working in indigo processing, and if we can find records about her life and circumstances, it would contribute valuable information to our understanding of rural economic life in post-Civil War North Carolina. He looked at Sarah. Are you interested in pursuing this? It would require research beyond your restoration work. Sarah didn't hesitate. For the first time in months, she felt genuine excitement about her work. This wasn't just another damaged photograph to repair and catalog. This was a mystery, a human story waiting to be uncovered. Yes, she said firmly. I want to know who Anne-Marie Caldwell was. And I want to know why her feet were stained dark in the summer of 1874. James smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Then we have work to do. The Madison County Historical Society archives would be the logical place to start. They have church records, census data, and local newspapers from that period. If Anne-Marie Caldwell lived in that community, there will be traces of her existence somewhere in the documentation. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but neither Sarah nor James noticed. They were already planning their research strategy, dividing tasks, and making lists of potential sources. The photograph of Hickory Grove Church lay on the desk between them, and Marie Caldwell's image frozen in time, her darkly stained feet a silent testament to a life and a story that had waited nearly 150 years to be told. The Madison County Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street in Marshall, North Carolina, a town of fewer than 1,000 residents nestled in a valley where the French Broad River carved through the mountains. Sarah drove there 3 days after her meeting with James, her compact car navigating the winding mountain roads with practiced ease. She had grown up in these mountains, though in neighboring Buncombe County, and the landscape felt familiar even as the GPS guided her through unfamiliar turns. Marshall itself seemed suspended in time, its downtown consisting of a single street lined with buildings that dated back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. The county courthouse, an impressive stone structure, dominated the town center, while smaller commercial buildings clustered around it like supplicants before a king. The French Broad River rushed past just below the main street, its waters brown and turbid from recent rains. Sarah could hear it even with her car windows closed, a constant presence in the town's life. The Historical Society building was painted a pale yellow, with white trim and a wraparound porch that suggested genteel southern living. Sarah climbed the steps, noting the careful maintenance that kept the old structure in good repair. A small brass plaque beside the door announced visiting hours and membership information. She entered to find herself in what had once been the home's parlor, now converted into a reception area lined with glass display cases containing artifacts from Madison County's past. An elderly woman sat behind a desk made from what appeared to be an old library card catalog. She looked up as Sarah entered, her face breaking into a welcoming smile. "Good morning. I'm Martha Reynolds, the director here. You must be Ms. Mitchell? Dr. Harding called ahead to let us know you'd be visiting." Sarah shook the offered hand, noting the woman's firm grip and direct gaze. Martha Reynolds appeared to be in her 70s, with white hair cut in a practical bob and glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She wore a cardigan despite the warmth of the day, and her desk was organized with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime managing information. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Sarah said. Dr. Harding explained what we're researching? The Hickory Grove Church photograph, yes. And the child with the stained feet. Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "I'll admit, when James called and described it, I was intrigued. We have some materials related to Hickory Grove and the families who attended services there. The church itself is long gone, of course, but we've preserved what records we could find. She stood, gesturing for Sarah to follow. Our research room is upstairs. I've pulled some materials that might be relevant. The research room occupied what had once been a bedroom on the second floor. Long tables were arranged beneath windows that looked out over the river, and metal shelving units lined the walls, filled with archival boxes and bound volumes. Martha had set out several items on one of the tables: leather-bound ledgers, a box of loose papers, and what appeared to be church records. "These are the Hickory Grove church records," Martha explained, indicating the largest ledger. "They cover baptisms, marriages, and deaths from 1867 to 1923, when the church burned. We also have some congregational meeting minutes and financial records. The other materials are from the Madison County Census records for 1870 and 1880, and some local newspaper clippings from the Asheville Citizen-Times and the Marshall News Record." Sarah carefully opened the church record book, its pages yellowed with age but still legible. The handwriting was elegant, the work of someone who took pride in their penmanship. She ran her finger down the baptism records, looking for the name Caldwell. There were several entries: Thomas Caldwell, baptized 1868. Sarah Jane Caldwell, baptized 1869. And there, in slightly different handwriting, dated July 1864, and Marie Caldwell, daughter of John and Margaret Caldwell. "Found her," Sarah said quietly. Martha leaned over to look, nodding. "That would make her 10 years old in 1874, when your photograph was taken. Let's see if we can find the family in the census records." They spent the next hour working through the materials Martha had assembled. The 1870 census for Madison County listed John Caldwell, age 38, farmer. Margaret Caldwell, age 35, keeping house. Anne Marie Caldwell, age 6. Thomas Caldwell, age 2. The family was listed as owning their property, valued at $400, a modest but respectable sum for the area at that time. Their occupation was listed simply as farming. But it was in the newspaper clippings that Sarah found the first real clues to Anne Marie's story. Martha had included several articles from the Asheville Citizen-Times from the 1870s, including one from August 1874, just months after the church photograph would have been taken. The headline read, "Indigo Revival in Madison County, Local Farmers Find Profit in Traditional Dye." Sarah read the article aloud. "Several families in the Hickory Grove area of Madison County have recently revived the cultivation and processing of indigo plants, a practice not widely seen in the mountain region since before the war." Mr. John Caldwell, speaking to this reporter, explained that the dye commands excellent prices in Asheville and beyond, where it is used in textile manufacturing. "The work is demanding," Mr. Caldwell noted, requiring the entire family's participation during the processing season. "The indigo must be harvested at precisely the right time, then fermented and processed within days to achieve the highest quality dye." Martha pointed to another clipping from September 1875. This one mentions the Caldwell family specifically. The article was shorter, a brief human interest piece. The dedication of the Caldwell family to their indigo operation has become well known throughout the county. Even the youngest members contribute to the work, with daughter and Marie proving particularly skilled at the treading process, by which the harvested plants are crushed to begin fermentation. The traditional method requires barefoot work, and young and Marie's feet bear the distinctive dark staining that marks all who work closely with indigo. Mrs. Margaret Caldwell reports that the family hopes to expand their operation next season. Sarah sat back, the pieces beginning to fit together. So Anne Marie was working in indigo processing, specifically the treading part where she would crush the plant material with her feet. That's why they were so darkly stained. It wasn't just incidental contact, it was her regular job within the family operation. Martha nodded slowly. Indigo processing was labor-intensive work. In the larger operations in the coastal regions before the Civil War, enslaved people did most of the processing. It was hot, difficult, and the chemicals could be harsh on the skin. After the war, when those large operations mostly collapsed, some families in the mountains tried to revive indigo production on a smaller scale, using family labor instead. She paused, choosing her words carefully. It's important to understand that this wasn't seen as unusual at the time. Children were expected to contribute to family enterprises. Farming families, in particular, relied on everyone working together. Anne-Marie's role in the indigo processing would have been considered her natural contribution to the household. Sarah understood what Martha was saying, but something about the child's expression in the photograph bothered her. There was a difference between a child helping with farm chores and a child whose feet were stained almost black from constant chemical exposure. Did you find anything else about Anne-Marie? Later census records, marriage records, anything that would tell us what happened to her? Martha's expression grew somber. That's where the story takes a troubling turn. Let me show you something. She opened another ledger, this one from the church death records. Her finger traced down the page to an entry from October 1876. Anne-Marie Caldwell, age 12 years, died October 15, 1876. Cause of death, respiratory ailment. The words seemed to hang in the air. Sarah stared at the neat handwriting that recorded the end of a young life with such bureaucratic efficiency. She died 2 years after the photograph was taken. Only 12 years old. Respiratory ailments were common in that era, Martha said gently. Poor nutrition, exposure to harsh weather, lack of medical care, there were many factors. But she hesitated, then continued. There's been some recent historical research suggesting that indigo processing could cause respiratory problems. The fermentation process produces strong fumes, and constant exposure, especially in enclosed spaces, could damage the lungs. I'm not saying that's definitely what happened to Anne-Marie, but it's possible that her work in the indigo operation contributed to her illness. Sarah felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She looked at the photograph she had brought with her, studying Anne-Marie's face with new understanding. This wasn't just a historical curiosity or an interesting restoration project. This was a real child who had worked hard to help her family, whose feet bore the physical marks of that labor, and who had died young, possibly as a consequence of that same work. The sadness in her expression in the photograph now seemed prophetic, as if she somehow knew that her life would be short. Is there anything else? Sarah asked. Any other records about the family or what happened after Anne-Marie died? Martha pulled out the 1880 census. The family stayed in the area. John and Margaret Caldwell are still listed, along with Thomas and 2 more children, born in 1877 and 1879. John's occupation is listed as general farming, with no specific mention of indigo. I suspect they may have stopped the indigo operation after Anne-Marie's death, though we can't know for certain. Sarah spent the rest of the day going through the materials, taking photographs of relevant documents and making detailed notes. She found a few more references to the Hickory Grove community and its brief involvement in indigo processing, but most of the operations had ceased by 1880. The market for locally produced indigo had apparently dried up, unable to compete with cheaper imports and the rise of synthetic dyes that were beginning to appear in the marketplace. As the afternoon light began to fade, Martha brought Sarah a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "What will you do with this information?" she asked. Sarah looked up from her notes, considering the question. "I want to tell Anne-Marie's story properly. Not as a tragedy or an example of exploitation, but as a real person who lived and worked and was part of her community. The photograph is remarkable. It's one of the clearest images I've ever seen from that era, and now we know why her feet were stained dark. It's a piece of Appalachian history that hasn't been well documented. Children's lives, children's work, the small-scale economic experiments that families tried in the years after the Civil War, these stories matter." Martha smiled. "I think Anne-Marie would appreciate having her story told. And it is an important piece of history. The indigo operations in Madison County have been almost completely forgotten. Most people don't even know they existed. If you're planning to write this up or present it publicly, I'd be happy to help with additional research if you need it." "Thank you," Sarah said sincerely. "I really appreciate all your help today. You've given me so much more than I expected to find." As Sarah drove back to Asheville that evening, the mountain roads dark and winding, she found herself thinking about Anne-Marie Caldwell. A girl born in the turbulent years of the Civil War, who grew up in the hardscrabble world of Appalachian subsistence farming, who worked barefoot in indigo vats to help her family survive, and who died at 12, possibly from the effects of that same work. Her life had been brief and hard, but not meaningless. She had been photographed with her church community, carefully recorded in baptism and death records, remembered in the oral histories that Martha had shared. And now, nearly 150 years later, people were still interested in her story, still moved by the image of her dark-stained feet and sad expression. Sarah felt a sense of responsibility settling over her. She had started this research out of professional curiosity, intrigued by an unusual detail in an old photograph. But it had become something more. Anne-Marie Caldwell deserved to have her story told with care and respect, not sensationalized or used simply to illustrate historical themes. She was a real person, and her life, however brief, had value and meaning. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the lecture hall at UNC Asheville, watching as people filed in for the presentation she and James Harding had organized. The room was designed to hold about 100 people, and to Sarah's surprise, it was nearly full. Students, faculty members, local historians, members of the community, all had come to hear about the discovery of the Hickory Grove church photograph and the story of Anne-Marie Caldwell. Sarah felt nervous in a way she hadn't anticipated. Public speaking had never been her strength, and she much preferred the solitary work of photographic restoration to standing in front of an audience. But James had convinced her that the story deserved to be shared widely, and that her direct involvement in the discovery made her the right person to present the findings. James stood at the front of the room, testing the projection system and arranging his notes. He caught Sarah's eye and gave her an encouraging smile. They had planned the presentation carefully over the past weeks, dividing the material between them. James would provide the historical context about Appalachian economic life in the 1870s and the indigo trade. Sarah would focus on the photograph itself, the restoration process, and the personal story of Anne-Marie Caldwell. The lights dimmed, and James stepped to the podium. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Tonight, we're going to share a discovery that began with a routine photographic restoration and evolved into a fascinating glimpse into a little-known aspect of Appalachian history. My colleague, Sarah Mitchell, will be joining me to present our findings." He advanced the first slide, showing the full Hickory Grove church photograph. This image was taken in the summer of 1874 in Madison County, North Carolina. At first glance, it appears to be a typical church group portrait of the era. But a closer examination revealed something unexpected. He zoomed in on Anne-Marie Caldwell's figure, and Sarah heard a murmur ripple through the audience as the dark staining on the child's feet became visible. James let the image speak for itself for a moment before continuing. "The dark coloration you see on this child's feet is not a defect in the photograph or damage to the image. It was present when the photograph was taken, captured by the camera as part of the original scene. The question, of course, is why? What would cause a child's feet to be stained so darkly? And what does this tell us about life in Appalachian communities in the years following the Civil War?" For the next 20 minutes, James walked the audience through the historical background. He explained the economic devastation that the Civil War had brought to the region, the collapse of traditional markets, and the desperate search for new sources of income. He discussed the indigo trade, showing images of indigo plants and explaining the complex process of extracting and processing the dye. He placed the Hickory Grove community in the larger context of rural economic experimentation in the post-war period. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stepped to the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her notes. "Thank you, Dr. Harding, for that context. I want to tell you about Anne-Marie Caldwell, the girl in this photograph, whose stained feet led us to this research." She advanced the slide to show a close-up of Anne-Marie's face. "When I first noticed the unusual staining on her feet, I saw it as a technical puzzle to be solved. But as I researched her story, she became a real person to me, not just a historical subject." Sarah walked the audience through her research process, showing documents from the Madison County Historical Society, census records, church records, and newspaper articles. She explained the role Anne-Marie played in her family's indigo operation, the physical labor of treading the plant material, the chemical staining that resulted from constant exposure. She spoke carefully, aware that the line between historical documentation and sensationalism was thin, determined to honor Anne-Marie's memory by presenting the facts without unnecessary dramatization. When she reached the part about Anne-Marie's death at age 12, Sarah paused. The room had grown very quiet. Anne-Marie Caldwell died on October 15, 1876, of a respiratory ailment. We can't know with certainty whether her work in indigo processing contributed to her illness. Medical understanding of occupational health hazards was very different in the 1870s, and respiratory ailments could have many causes. What we can say is that Anne-Marie worked hard to help her family survive in difficult economic times, that her labor left visible marks on her body, and that her life was tragically short. She showed the final slide, a split screen with Anne-Marie's face on one side and a list of facts about child labor in Appalachian communities in the late 19th century on the other. Anne-Marie's story is important not because it's unusual, but because it's representative of experiences that were common but poorly documented. Children in rural communities were expected to work, to contribute to family economic survival. Most of this labor was agricultural and has left little historical record. Anne-Marie is visible to us because she happened to be photographed, because the image was preserved, and because the physical evidence of her labor, the dark staining on her feet, was captured in that photograph. How many other children like her existed, whose stories weren't preserved? We'll never know. But we can honor Anne-Marie's memory by telling her story accurately and with respect. The presentation concluded with a question and answer session. The audience's engagement was intense, with questions ranging from technical inquiries about photographic restoration to broader questions about labor practices and children's lives in the 19th century. One woman in the back stood up, her voice trembling slightly. My grandmother grew up in Madison County in the early 1900s. She used to tell stories about the old days, about how hard everyone worked just to survive. I never really understood what she meant until tonight. Thank you for bringing this history to life. After the formal presentation ended, people crowded around Sarah and James, wanting to see the photograph up close, to ask follow-up questions, to share their own family stories of hardship and survival in the mountains. Sarah found herself energized rather than drained by the interaction. The nervousness she had felt before the presentation had transformed into something else, a sense of connection to the community, a feeling that this work mattered in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. An older man approached Sarah, his weathered face thoughtful. "I'm Robert Caldwell," he said, extending his hand. "I believe Anne-Marie was my great-great-aunt. My family has lived in Madison County for generations, though I didn't know much about this particular branch until tonight. Would it be possible to get copies of the documents you found? I'd like to add them to our family records." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She was standing face to face with a descendant of Anne-Marie Caldwell, a living connection to the story she had uncovered. "Of course," she managed to say. "I'd be honored to share everything we found. Did your family preserve any stories about Anne-Marie or the indigo operation?" Robert shook his head slowly. "Not much. There's a family story about a young girl who died young, and about my great-great-grandfather John trying different farming ventures that didn't pan out. But the specifics were lost over the generations. Seeing this photograph, hearing her story told with such care, it means more than I can express. You've given us back a piece of our family history we didn't know we'd lost." Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the lecture hall had emptied, Sarah and James sat in his office, reviewing the presentation and discussing next steps. James had been contacted by a regional history journal interested in publishing an article about the discovery. Sarah had received inquiries from 2 other historical societies in neighboring counties, asking if she would examine their photographic collections for similar details that might reveal forgotten stories. "You did well tonight," James said, pouring them both coffee from his office maker. "I know public speaking isn't your favorite activity, but you told Anne-Marie's story beautifully. With respect and care, but without shying away from the difficult realities. That's not easy to do." Sarah cradled the warm mug in her hands, feeling the exhaustion of the evening catching up with her. Meeting Robert Caldwell, Anne-Marie's descendant, that made it all feel different. More personal, more real. I knew intellectually that she had been a real person with family and connections, but seeing someone who shares her blood, who cares about preserving her memory, that brought it home in a new way. That's the power of this kind of work, James said thoughtfully. We talk about history as if it's this distant, abstract thing. Dates and events and trends. But history is really about people, individual human beings with hopes and fears and daily struggles. When we can connect to those individuals, when we can see them as real people rather than just data points, that's when history becomes meaningful. Sarah nodded, thinking about the past few weeks of research, the hours spent in archives and libraries, the careful examination of documents and photographs. I want to keep doing this, she said suddenly. Not just restoration work, but research. Finding these hidden stories in old photographs and bringing them to light. There must be hundreds, maybe thousands, of images sitting in archives and attics with similar stories waiting to be discovered. James smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, because I have a proposal for you. The Historical Society has received a grant to digitize and catalog their entire photographic collection, about 5,000 images dating from the 1850s to the 1960s. They need someone to lead the project, someone with restoration expertise but also the research skills to properly document and contextualize the images. The position would be part-time, but it would give you the opportunity to work with a massive collection of Appalachian historical photographs. I recommended you for the position. The board meets next week to make a final decision, but I think you have an excellent chance. Sarah felt her heart race. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she hadn't known she was looking for, a chance to combine her technical skills with the research and storytelling that had come to fascinate her through Anne-Marie's story. I want it, she said without hesitation. Whatever I need to do to get that position, I'll do it. Write up a proposal, James suggested. Outline your vision for the project, emphasizing the importance of not just digitizing the images but researching the stories behind them. The board appreciates concrete ideas and clear objectives. And include your work on the Hickory Grove photograph as an example of what's possible when you take the time to really investigate an image rather than just scanning and cataloging it. Sarah left the campus that night with her mind spinning with ideas. She drove through the dark streets of Asheville, seeing the city with fresh eyes. How many forgotten stories were hidden in the historical records scattered throughout this region? How many faces stared out from old photographs, their lives unexamined, their experiences unrecorded? Anne-Marie Caldwell had been lucky, in a way. Her image had been preserved, her story had survived in fragmentary form in various archives, and now, nearly 150 years after her death, people knew her name and understood something of her brief life. But she represented just one story among thousands, and Sarah felt a growing determination to uncover as many of those stories as possible. 6 months later, Sarah sat in her new office at the Asheville Historical Society, surrounded by boxes of photographic materials waiting to be processed. The grant-funded position had come through, and she had spent the past half-year developing a systematic approach to digitizing, cataloging, and researching the Society's extensive photographic collection. But more than that, she had discovered a calling that combined her technical expertise with a passion for storytelling that she hadn't known she possessed. The Hickory Grove church photograph hung on the wall behind her desk, a high-quality print that captured every detail of the original glass plate negative. Visitors to her office always noticed it, their eyes drawn to Anne-Marie Caldwell's figure and her distinctively stained feet. Sarah had told the story so many times now that it had become almost rehearsed, but it never failed to move people. There was something about the image, about the visible evidence of a child's labor captured in such stark detail, that resonated with audiences in a way that simple text descriptions never could. Her article about the photograph and Anne-Marie's story had been published in the Appalachian Regional History Journal in March, generating significant interest in both academic and popular circles. She had given presentations at 3 regional history conferences, and the story had been picked up by several newspapers and online media outlets. The photograph itself had become something of an icon, used in discussions about child labor history, Appalachian economic life, and the power of historical photographs to reveal hidden stories. But it was the personal connections that had meant the most to Sarah. Robert Caldwell had become a friend and collaborator, sharing family documents and oral histories that added depth to Anne-Marie's story. Together, they had located Anne-Marie's grave in the small cemetery adjacent to where Hickory Grove Church had once stood. The headstone was simple, weathered by almost 150 years of mountain weather, but still legible. Anne-Marie Caldwell, 1864 to 1876, beloved daughter. Robert had arranged for the stone to be professionally cleaned and restored, and the Madison County Historical Society had installed an interpretive marker explaining Anne-Marie's connection to the local indigo trade. Through Robert, Sarah had connected with other members of the extended Caldwell family, creating a network of descendants who were eager to preserve and share their family history. They had provided photographs, letters, land records, and personal items that helped Sarah build a more complete picture of life in the Hickory Grove community. One cousin had even discovered a ledger kept by John Caldwell detailing his indigo operation, including production figures, sales, and expenses. The ledger confirmed that Anne-Marie had indeed been involved in the processing work, her labor recorded alongside that of other family members. More significantly, Sarah's work on Anne-Marie's story had inspired similar research efforts throughout the region. Other historians and archivists had begun examining their collections with fresh eyes, looking for the hidden details that might reveal untold stories. A colleague in Tennessee had discovered a series of photographs showing children working in small-scale mining operations, their hands and faces stained with coal dust. Another researcher in Virginia had found images of girls as young as 8 or 9 working in textile mills, their exhausted expressions telling their own stories. Each discovery added to a growing body of evidence about children's labor in the Appalachian region, challenging popular narratives and providing a more nuanced understanding of economic and social life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sarah had also developed a relationship with a documentary filmmaker named Patricia Henderson, who was working on a project about forgotten Appalachian history. Patricia was particularly interested in Anne-Marie's story and wanted to feature it as the centerpiece of her film. They had spent several days filming at the Historical Society, in Madison County, and at the site of the former Hickory Grove Church. Patricia's approach was thoughtful and respectful, focused on telling Anne-Marie's story without sensationalizing or exploiting it. The documentary was scheduled to premiere at a regional film festival in the fall, with potential national distribution afterward. On this particular morning, Sarah was preparing for a visit from a group of middle school students from Marshall. Their teacher, inspired by the article about Anne-Marie, had designed a unit on local history and wanted the students to learn about historical research methods. Sarah had agreed to give them a tour of the archives and to talk about how she had uncovered Anne-Marie's story. She believed strongly in engaging young people with history, helping them understand that the past wasn't just something that happened to other people in distant places, but was woven into the fabric of their own communities and families. The students arrived at 10 o'clock, a noisy group of 12 and 13-year-olds accompanied by their teacher, Ms. Reynolds, no relation to Martha Reynolds at the Madison County Historical Society, though the coincidence always made Sarah smile. After a brief introduction in the main gallery, Sarah led them upstairs to the research room where she had set out materials related to Anne-Marie's story. History isn't just about memorizing dates and names, Sarah began, standing in front of the group. It's about asking questions and finding evidence to answer those questions. When I first saw the Hickory Grove Church photograph, I had a question. Why were this child's feet stained dark? That simple question led to weeks of research and eventually to the story I'm going to share with you today. She walked them through the process, showing them the original photograph, explaining how she had noticed the unusual detail during the restoration process, describing her collaboration with Dr. Harding and her research at the Madison County Historical Society. The students were more engaged than she had expected, asking thoughtful questions and making connections to their own family histories. One girl raised her hand. "My great-grandmother told me stories about working in her family's tobacco fields when she was a kid. She said everyone had to help or they wouldn't have enough money to get through the winter. Is that similar to what Anne-Marie was doing?" "Yes, exactly," Sarah said. In agricultural communities, children were expected to contribute to the family's economic survival. That was considered normal, even necessary. The difference with Anne-Marie is that we have photographic evidence of her labor, the staining on her feet that shows the specific work she was doing. That kind of physical evidence is rare in historical records. Another student, a boy sitting in the back, spoke up without raising his hand. Did Anne-Marie want to work in the indigo processing? Or did she have to because her parents made her? It was a good question, one that Sarah had wrestled with herself. We don't know what Anne-Marie thought or felt about her work. She left no diary or letters that survived, and the historical record doesn't include her voice directly. We can make educated guesses based on what we know about family dynamics in that era and the economic pressures families faced, but we have to be careful not to impose our modern values and expectations on people who lived in very different circumstances. What we can say is that Anne-Marie's labor was valued by her family, that it contributed to their survival, and that it left physical marks on her body that were considered significant enough to be recorded in a formal photograph. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes, with students asking about everything from photographic technology in the 1870s to the health effects of indigo processing to what happened to the Caldwell family after Anne-Marie's death. Sarah was impressed by their curiosity and engagement. These young people, growing up in the same region where Anne-Marie had lived and died, were connecting to her story in a personal way, seeing her not as a distant historical figure but as someone who could have been their neighbor, their classmate, their friend. As the visit concluded and the students prepared to leave, Ms. Reynolds pulled Sarah aside. "Thank you for this. I've been teaching local history for 15 years, and it's rare to see students this engaged with historical material. There's something about Anne-Marie's story, the photograph, the visible evidence of her labor, the fact that she was close to their age, that makes it real for them in a way that textbook accounts never do." Sarah watched the students file out, their voices echoing in the stairwell. "I think that's the power of individual stories. We can talk about child labor in the abstract, about economic conditions and social norms, but when we focus on one person, one life, one face in a photograph, it becomes human in a way that generalizations never can." Anne-Marie matters not because she represents broader historical trends, but because she was a real child who lived and worked and died in these mountains. Her story deserves to be told for its own sake, not just as an illustration of historical themes. That afternoon, after the students had left, Sarah returned to her work on the photographic collection. She had been making steady progress through the boxes, digitizing images, researching subjects, and building a comprehensive database of information about each photograph. Every day brought new discoveries, images of daily life in the mountains, portraits of families long forgotten, landscapes that had been transformed by time and development. Some images required extensive research to contextualize, while others spoke for themselves with immediate clarity. But she found herself returning repeatedly to the Hickory Grove church photograph, drawn by something she couldn't quite articulate. Anne-Marie Caldwell's face, frozen in that moment in the summer of 1874, seemed to hold a question or a challenge. "What did you learn from my story? What difference will it make?" Sarah had no easy answers, but she felt certain that the work she was doing mattered. Every photograph she restored and researched, every story she uncovered and shared, was an act of remembrance and respect for people whose lives might otherwise be forgotten entirely. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was James Harding. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with the National Archives. They're interested in the methodological approach you've developed for researching photographic collections. They want you to present at their symposium on visual culture and historical documentation next spring in Washington. This could be significant. If the National Archives adopts your protocols, it could influence how photographic collections are processed throughout the country." Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with disbelief. "Are you serious? The National Archives?" "Completely serious. Your work on the Hickory Grove photograph and the subsequent research you've done with the Historical Society's collection has caught attention in places I didn't expect. You're developing a reputation as an innovator in the field, someone who understands that photographic restoration isn't just about preserving images but about recovering the stories those images contain." He paused. "You should be proud of what you've accomplished. A year ago, you were feeling burned out and disconnected from your work. Now you're at the forefront of a movement to transform how we approach historical photography. After ending the call, Sarah sat quietly in her office, processing what James had told her. She thought about the journey that had begun with noticing an unusual detail in an old photograph, about the research that had followed, about the story of Anne Marie Caldwell that had emerged from fragments of historical documentation. She thought about Robert Caldwell and the other family members who had welcomed her into their lives, about the students who had visited that morning and their genuine engagement with Anne Marie's story, about the documentary film being made and the articles being written and the growing recognition that individual stories matter. Anne Marie Caldwell had lived a brief life in difficult circumstances, her childhood marked by hard physical labor and ended by early death. But her story had not ended in that cemetery in Madison County in 1876. Through the preservation of a single photograph, through the dedication of researchers and archivists and historians, through the interest of descendants and students and community members, Anne Marie's life continued to have meaning and impact almost 150 years after her death. That, Sarah thought, was the true power of historical work, not just preserving the past, but keeping it alive, allowing it to inform and illuminate the present. The rain that had been threatening all day finally began to fall, drops pattering against the office window. Sarah turned to look at the Hickory Grove Church photograph on her wall. In the fading afternoon light, Anne Marie's face seemed almost to come alive, her eyes meeting Sarah's across the gulf of time. "Thank you," Sarah thought. "Thank you for being visible, for leaving evidence of your life, for allowing your story to be told. I will make sure you are remembered." She turned back to her computer and opened a new document. The National Archives presentation would require careful preparation, but she already knew what her central message would be. Every photograph contains stories waiting to be discovered, every face in those images represents a life that mattered, and it is our responsibility as researchers and archivists to honor those lives by telling their stories with care, accuracy, and respect. Anne Marie Caldwell had taught her that, and it was a lesson Sarah would carry forward in all her future work. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the mountains, on the city, on the place where Hickory Grove Church had once stood, on the small cemetery where Anne Marie rested. The world had changed dramatically since 1874, but the mountains remained, and the stories of those who had lived among them persisted, waiting to be discovered by anyone willing to look closely enough, to ask the right questions, and to listen for the voices that history had tried to silence. Sarah was listening now, and she would make sure that others heard those voices too. Anne Marie Caldwell's story was just the beginning.